In the past year, I've had 3 or 4 conversations regarding the nature of religion or the nature of God. I think that they all followed this a similar pattern in terms of what they were trying to bring out of an atheistic argument. They were definitely not so much talking about the institution of religion, but more the nature of God. And I think there's lots of arguments for the nature of God, but I don't think that the conversations I had were centering on the philosophical arguments, like say the ontological argument, the transcendental argument, or the cosmological arguments. I think they were kind of veering in the direction of everyone has a personal relationship with God. So without bringing in all the redundancies of the way in which people talk about God, about God being love or God being energy or whatever, I think it's important to kind of address the personal relationship they talk about or they're alluding to when they talk about God. It's almost like a pantheistic belief. They think that God is everywhere and everything, and I think that's a fairly contemporary way of thinking about God. He's everything and blah blah blah. So to begin with, I think this is going to be a confusing video, but to begin with, when they talk about institutionalized religion, I think what's happening there is they're kind of wiping all the doctrine off the table, because that's not how you think about God in the contemporary way. And even if you pick and choose from different religions or from one religion what you believe and what you don't believe, you're kind of dismissing doctrine altogether, even if it's inversely so. You're kind of just wiping all of doctrine off the table, because how can a perfect doctrine be not so perfect in some ways and perfect in other ways? I mean, you're applying some sort of extra doctrinal sort of bias on what you're picking through. So like I said, inversely, you're kind of just wiping the slate clean of all doctrine, all institutionalized religion. Like, it's just out the window. And what you're left with is basically asking for, even though you don't go there, you don't go to the philosophical arguments. I don't think that's what these 4 conversations I've had were kind of implying. They weren't thinking about the philosophical arguments for God, although there was a really good one I read on Atheist Republic about how omniscience and free will can't exist together in a being called God. It was a pretty good piece of writing, so I enjoyed that. So without talking about the nature of God, I think you have to, in a philosophical sense, you have to ask, well, what are these arguments going for? And I think it goes back to the whole personal relationship with God. But why would God have such suffering in the world only to just make you very happy, or make you, or even the suffering you go through in your day-to-day life? There's varying levels to which people suffer in their lives. Why go through that only to know God? Like, it's almost psychopathic. Like, it's almost like putting God in a psychopathic category. Like, he makes you suffer only to know him. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Why would a benevolent being, all powerful, who created everything, go do that? Aren't there other ways that you could know an all-powerful benevolent being, minus the suffering of not just things that you go through, but the suffering of millions of other people, to put it simply. So those are sort of the sticking points. But sometimes I wonder if it's worth actually going into the philosophical arguments for God and how they're flawed, because there's a lot of philosophical arguments about God and morality, etc., but there are counter arguments, etc. But I think if you go into what God does and what he's doing in a philosophical sense, I think you've kind of lost the conversation a little bit based on the 3 or 4 conversations I had. I don't think the philosophy is quite in that conversation just yet. It's sort of like this post-religious mindset of God being everywhere, etc. But yeah, that's my video. That's all I gotta say on that. I might have more interesting things to say later, but that's it for now. Bye.